Hey everyone, Omogonix here and welcome back to a brand new video here on the channel. I've gotten a bunch of comments and messages from people over time asking me how I was able to get the hang of coding and game development in general. I do know that some of you out there do struggle to advance your game dev skills, so I thought I'd make this video today to talk about how I've learned game development over the years and give you guys some tips on how you can learn to make games easier, and hopefully you guys can take some info away from this video and apply it to your own lives to try and improve your own game dev skills too. Overall, just remember that game development takes time and everybody learns at a different pace. Remember not to compare yourself to others and keep improving. If you do find that you're comparing yourself to others, use that as motivation to continue improving. Don't let it make you upset. Even I find that I compare myself to others sometimes, and it's normal to, but it's not good to let it negatively affect you. So first off, I wanted to talk about tutorials. When I first got into making games, I used to watch a bunch of tutorials. I still do watch tutorials from time to time. I used to watch mainly Unity tutorials, since Unity was the main engine I was interested in learning at the time. I used to find it hard to follow along with some tutorials, particularly more advanced ones, because I sucked at programming at the time, and it was very confusing to me. But with the tutorials that I did properly learn from, some of the things I did learn in them tutorials were able to stick with me up until now even. For example, I forget the creator's name, but there's a tutorial I watched on how to make triggers in Unity, and what I had learned from that simple tutorial had stuck with me throughout the rest of the time I had continued to use Unity, because I would make many triggers in my Unity games, and the code I write for those triggers is very similar to the tutorial I watched all them years ago, because it stuck with me throughout this whole time. Basically, if you're very new to game dev, don't try to get ahead of yourself and watch tutorials that may seem out of your depth for the time being, because if you're completely new to game dev, you're not going to understand the context of things and are going to be very confused depending on what the tutorial is about and how much is involved in it. Also depends on the engine too. The reason I used to struggle with a bunch of tutorials is because I hadn't learned enough at the time to be able to understand them tutorials properly. It is possible to follow along with a tutorial even if you don't 100% understand what's going on, but I do find it a lot easier to actually have more knowledge, so when you might want to watch a more advanced tutorial, not only will you be able to understand it easier, but if there's coding involved, it'll stick easier in your head, especially the more you write it down for future scripts in future games. With that trigger tutorial I mentioned as an example earlier, the reason why that code has stuck with me up until now even is because A, it was in my opinion a very beginner friendly tutorial, and B, I use triggers so often in my Unity games, sometimes I might write multiple scripts in a singular game with some form of trigger function, whether it may be on trigger enter, on trigger stay, on trigger exit. I'm pretty sure the trigger tutorial I watched was only for on trigger enter, but I did eventually look up if there are other types of on trigger functions as well. That's how I found out about them. Overall, when you're new to game dev or aren't that experienced, you will probably find some tutorials harder to understand and follow along with properly. Start with more beginner friendly tutorials. That way, the things you do learn from those tutorials will hopefully stick with you if the things you learned from it are something you can make use of often. Tutorials aren't the only way to learn how to make games, of course. There's plenty of different kinds of resources online, such as official documentation from the devs who made the very engine you use, etc. I personally don't watch tutorials much these days. They're definitely not my primary way of learning, but they definitely are useful, especially since it's good to see how something visually works in video form, so it can be an easier way for some people to learn, and that now leads us into the next thing I want to talk about. So depending on the engine you use, there may be documentation for you to look at online or even offline. Most engines I've used generally have documentation, and it's a good resource to use if you ever want to learn about how specific things work so you can properly know what you're doing. I'll commonly use Godot documentation, for example, if there's something I need extra context on so I can make sure I'm doing it right. I do recommend looking into the documentation of whatever engine you use when starting out. Documentation is one of the best ways to learn more about the engine you're using, as it usually comes straight from the devs of the engine themselves, so there should be lots of context to explain things. Something which has really helped me get the hang of programming and game development in general over the last couple of years is remembering certain variables, functions, and other things I might learn from somewhere. So let me further explain what I mean. So let's say, for example, you're watching a tutorial on how to make a working door for a first-person game. Now, not only are you actually just simply learning how to make a working door, you're learning about all the small things that are needed in order to get that door working in the first place. For example, in the tutorial you're watching, the person might show how to make animations for your door, therefore they're teaching you about how animations work in the engine. They might even teach you about raycasting if they're using that as a method of interacting with the door. They'll teach you about the inputs, all of the things that are needed in order to make the door work. When watching a tutorial, make sure to look at it deeper than the surface level. On the surface, it's a door tutorial. Beneath the surface, however, you're being taught not just how to make a door, but as I've already mentioned, you're learning all the small things that are needed in order to make the door work, and those things you learn can then be applied to other mechanics or systems you might want to make. Let's say, for example, after making working doors thanks to the door tutorial you watched, you then want to make working closets and drawers. Instead of watching tutorials on how to make working closets and drawers, you could attempt to make them yourself using the knowledge you learned from the door tutorial. Basically what I'm saying is a door tutorial isn't just useful for learning how to make doors, but it provides a good base understanding, so then you can learn how to make other things that are similar to working doors, such as closets, drawers, fridges, cupboards, vents, since they would technically work just like a door, it's just themed differently. If you learned about raycasting for interaction from a door tutorial, that could be something that sticks with you as you make more interactable objects in your game. Therefore, that one door tutorial could help more easily to understand how to make other objects interactable as well. Overall, as I mentioned before, look at tutorials beneath the surface level, not for what they are on the surface. Alright guys, so that's going to be the end of the video today. Hopefully you guys can take away something from that. One last thing I did just want to mention lastly as well is if you ever find yourself having any issues when you're making games, like you might experience bugs that you don't know how to fix, for example, there are usually other people out there who have probably had the same issue as you, or at least an issue that was very similar. Searching your problem on Google can definitely help you out a lot of the times to look for solutions to certain problems. Also, copying and pasting the specific error you are experiencing into the search bar would probably help as well, so then you can find other people who have had that same error pop up in your search. If you did enjoy, be sure to consider liking, commenting, and subscribing for more. Also consider checking out my games on my itch.io page, omogonixlachlan.itch.io, if you want to further show your support. And yeah, so I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.